Hello students, this is Dr. Hank. With this lecture, we are going to be talking about ecological impacts of oil spills. And as you may know, we are going to Amazon to study the impacts of oil spills. That's one of the major goals of this class. And with this lecture, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about potential ecological impacts, and then we can actually extrapolate this knowledge into Amazon. With this topic, we are going to be basically discuss about a few introductory material on oil explorations and spills, and then we'll talk about major impacts, and then I would use several case studies to specifically discuss about some of these threats and their impacts on biological systems and ecosystems. If you remember, Deepwater Horizon is the biggest oil spill in the US history, and Exxon Valdez was one of the famous ones which happened actually in 1989, and we have a lot of information for these two case studies, but for the last one, Ecuadorian Amazon, we don't. So the plan is we are going to be actually learning from the Deepwater Horizon and Exxon Valdez case studies, and then we'll use that knowledge to think about potential impacts at the Ecuadorian Amazon. Okay, so crude oil, that's the beast. So it's a complex mixture of hydrocarbons, and also there are some other organic compounds of sulfur, nitrogen, and oxygen. And although it's an organic product, it's poisonous. So under low concentrations you may not see any impacts, but think about a spill. So that's high concentration. So under high concentrations we would expect some negative impacts. And these petroleum products are a result of dead organic matter which was transformed into petroleum by heat and pressure. These are basically animals and plants that lived millions of years ago, and their dead bodies were trapped in deep sediments, deep layers of the earth, and as a result of intense pressure and heat, these organic matter matured into petroleum products. If you want to get them, then you have to drill it and get it, right? So when they are exploring and drilling for these crude oil, there's a possibility of spilling. And basically we are going to be actually talking about marine spills, and this graph actually shows the growth of crude oil production. So in 1930s, it's very low, less than 5 million barrels of crude oils per day. But now in 2012, it's 73 million barrels of crude oil per day, and you can see a steep growth of crude oil production industry. When you are producing more and more crude oil, there's a higher chance of oil spills. Let's focus on the major marine oil spills. I actually picked the marine oil spills because we don't have a lot of information of overland oil spills and their impacts, but we have some good information about the impacts of marine oil spills. And in this map you can see the famous Exxon Valdez, and we are going to be talking about this spill. But compared to Exxon Valdez, the recent one, look at this Deepwater Horizon. This one is the largest oil spill in the history of United States. So we are going to be talking about Deepwater Horizon and then Exxon Valdez, and then let's try to extrapolate that knowledge into Amazonian Ecuador. Okay, so first of all, let's go through the major impacts. So as I mentioned before, hydrocarbons, it's toxic in high concentration, and it can actually result direct death to wildlife to contaminated wildlife due to congestion, dehydration, sometimes kidney failure. And also in some specific cases you don't see any signs of contamination, but the animal is dead. And scientists have actually revealed that under low concentration it can actually suppress the immunity of these organisms and cause death indirectly. When we are focusing on marine oil spills, the most susceptible animal groups are seabirds, sea turtles, marine mammals, and benthic invertebrates. Benthic invertebrates are bottom-dwelling species like crabs, mollusks, corals. The second impact is the biomagnification of hydrocarbons. You may remember about the biomagnification when we were talking about pollution, biomagnification of DDT and mercury, and hydrocarbons could be one of the other pollutants which may actually biomagnify. So basically the concentration of these hydrocarbons will increase through the food chain, and you may actually find the highest concentrations of these hydrocarbons in toxic levels in top predators like carnivorous fish or killer whales, sea lions, things like that. The third one is a direct impact. So once the habitat is contaminated with oil, the organisms will have a hard time moving through it, and also they'll have a hard time finding food. So it can directly impact their body weight and the health or the body condition. And if you focus on the development of organisms, even slight concentrations of these spilled hydrocarbons can create some major issues with developing embryos. And they found that these contaminated hydrocarbons can interfere with heart development, especially with carnivorous fish. If you don't have a strong heart to pump blood all over of your body, then you can't actually swim efficiently. So they did some follow-up experiments, and they found that once you have contaminated, your swimming performance will decrease, mainly because of the issues with heart development. If you focus on plants, the oil contamination can greatly reduce the primary production, and even in some cases it can cause death of aquatic plants. The issue is, once you have a barrier, this oil layer between your body and the environment, it can cause issues for gas exchange. For plants, without carbon dioxide they cannot produce their own food, and also without oxygen they cannot live. So it can directly reduce the photosynthesis of plants, and also it can create toxicity to living cells, so that eventually the animal would die. And also in some cases the contaminated oil actually altered the metabolic pathways and creating a lot of issues for normal living cells and organisms. And also an immediate impact of oil spills is the destruction of habitat and breeding grounds. Once you have thick oil layers covering your habitat, your waters, your nests, you are done. Okay, so let's focus on the first case study, Exxon Valdez. It actually happened in 1989 in Alaska. The major reason was a grounding of a tanker. So basically this oil tanker changed its path due to some stormy conditions, and they actually hit a rock, and that spill generated more than 37,000 tons of crude oil. And in this map you can see this is the impact site, and within several days the oil actually spread all over the Alaskan Peninsula. This is Prince William Sound. So in 56 days the oil the contaminated oil traveled 470 miles, contaminating bunch of islands and breeding grounds of birds and marine mammals. So let's talk about the impacts of Exxon Valdez. So oil drifted over 30,000 kilometers, and this is beyond 56 days, and it contaminated lots of coastal and offshore wildlife habitats. And this area, Prince William Sound, is one of the strongholds of endangered sea otters, and nearly 40% of all the sea otters were killed due to this oil spill, and this is an endangered species. And I'm going to show you some more information about the impacts in a minute. And the other most impacted group of organisms is seabirds, and all of these islands are prime breeding and nursery grounds of lots of aquatic birds. And also in some other instances, they have noticed that the spilled oil impacted the killer whale populations. Basically the numbers dropped soon after the spill, but they don't know whether it's actually a real population decline due to death of organisms, death of killer whales, or they are suspecting that some of the pods have actually migrated to somewhere else to avoid the spill. And also, as I mentioned before, they have shown that the oil can actually impact the development of fish embryos and cause some issues with swimming performance. So please watch the video that I have uploaded on the Exxon Valdez spill. It's a really nice story, and it captures the entire story very well. Okay, so what happened to these sea otters? This graph actually summarizes the survival rates of otter pups, and the reference site is an uncontaminated site. Impact site is one of the contaminated spilled sites, and the survival rate is in the y-axis. So if you get like 1, that's 100% survival. 0.8 is 80% survival. So in the reference site or uncontaminated site, the otter pup has about 75% survival rate, but in the impact site it dropped almost by 25%. So it clearly indicates the negative impacts of spilled oil on otter pup survival. And this graph shows the condition, the body condition of otter pups. So basically this is an index of the relative health of organisms. In the reference site you can see clearly it's 141.1, but in the impact site it's way lower than that. And in this site basically the otter pups are skinny. So when you are measuring the body condition, basically you just divide the body weight by the total length. So in this case, in the reference site, these are fat otter pups, but in the impact size, these guys are skinny otter pups. So this may actually reflect the limited availability of food, and also the interference with their behavior and things like that. Okay, so this is another study. So these guys actually studied the survival rates of harlequin ducks. Harlequin duck is one of the most beautiful sea ducks, and basically they continuously studied the survival probability of female harlequin ducks over several winters through October, from October to March. And they had two sites, oiled birds and unoiled. So initially in the early winter, you can see there's no significant difference of the survival probability of unoiled and oiled birds. But what happened in January? So this is like the peak winter. So once they are entering the harshest period of the winter, the oiled birds could not tolerate those extreme conditions. So their survival dropped dramatically compared to the unoiled birds. I mean, both lines are declining, So the harsh conditions are actually killing bunch of birds, but the oil birds had very less survival probabilities compared to unoiled birds, and you can clearly see that they had a significant impact of oil contamination on their survival probabilities. Third one, what happened to the killer whales? uh, uh, Prince William Sound is a prime breeding and feeding grounds of bunch of killer whale pods, and these guys have been actually following two killer whale pods, AB pod and 81 group. So y-axis is the number of individuals and x-axis is the time. So initially, before the spill, the pods are very stable, but the spilling happened in 1989, and you can clearly see soon after the spill there's a sudden decline of the population size of both pods, and they are not sure whether this is a result of death of killer whales or they may have actually migrated to a different area to avoid the contamination. So either way, the populations crashed after the oil spill. Okay, so in this particular study, they actually experimentally evaluated the impact of various concentrations of oil on swimming performance. They actually evaluated both salmon and herring, which are two commercially important species in that area. Let's focus on this graph first, the salmon graph. They had actually three concentrations of oil. With salmon, they tested two concentrations, low exposure, this is low exposure, and high exposure, and this is uncontaminated control, and this axis actually shows the swimming speed. So as you can clearly see, the exposure to oil, both low exposure group 15 parts per billion and high exposure group 45 parts per billion, significantly reduced the swimming performance of salmon. And the same thing happened with herring, and again this blue line is the control, no oil, and this one is the very low exposure. Mainly all the fish died under 15 and 45, so they couldn't collect any data. But with very low exposure, 0.23 parts per billion, that's a very low concentration, and they have seen a significant reduction of herring swimming performance. So if you compare this information, and you can clearly see that herring is way sensitive to this contaminated oil than salmon. And once you can't swim properly, you can find food, you cannot evade from predators, your survival probability will be very low. Let's move to the next case study. This is the recent one. Deepwater Horizon happened in Gulf of Mexico, and the cause was a wellhead blowout, and it spilled 470,000 tons of crude oil. This is an estimate, and it could be more than this. And the spilling, the worst case was the spilling continued for about 3 months. They couldn't seal the wellhead properly, so they were struggling to seal it with various methods, but the spill occurred for 3 more months. And this actually picture shows you the magnitude of the spill. And this is the largest marine spill in recent US history, and it actually contaminated vast areas of Gulf of Mexico and also lots of coastal areas, including some wildlife reserves from Louisiana to Florida. This was a really big mess. And in this graph you can see this gray is the oil slick, the oil plume, the distribution of it, and this is the impact site. And all these green areas are wildlife reserves, and the black dots are contaminated areas. Okay, so what happened? Over 1600 kilometers of shoreline was affected, and this one impacted not only the wildlife, it impacted the fisheries, the tourism, and there were lots of social issues, and we are not going to talk any of those. We'll just focus on the ecological impacts. And like any other oil spill, this one generated lots and lots of death for aquatic birds, turtles, and marine mammals, and the reduction of body condition or relative health, and also in some cases they have observed increased levels of diseases or vulnerability to diseases, mainly because of immunity suppression. And also in this case they have noticed an increase of the number of stranded sea turtles after the spill. And also they have done some developmental work and clearly showed that this oil can clearly interfere with the development of embryos of large carnivorous fish. So let's explore a little bit more about this. Okay, so these are the numbers for all the dead animals, and this is as of November 2010, right? But they have recovered more and more dead animals as they progress, and this graph actually shows the numbers reported at I think this is University of Austin. The black is oiled and dead, so it's a direct result of oil spill. And this hashed area is oiled but live, and some of these individuals may have died after this study. But the weirdest part is no oil dead, and especially with mammals, if you look at this, you can see most of the organisms are dead, but there's no sign of any oil contamination. And later they found that this is a result of immunity suppression. So once you don't have immunity, you are very vulnerable for lots of other factors. And in this case they have specifically studied some dolphins, and they noticed that soon after the spill they had some serious issues with their weight, and most of them were anemic and suffering from lung and liver diseases. And in this picture you can actually see a part of dolphins moving through a oil plume. Look at the magnitude of those. And this study focused on the rates of stranded sea turtles. So typically they get few sea turtles like every month, and the blue bars indicates the average number of stranded turtles for a period of time from 1986 to 2007, for 11 years. So these are the averages, and in every case for every month the numbers are way below 50, as you can see. But red is 2010 numbers. March and April, these are just before the spill, and they are very comparable with historic data. But soon after the spill, look at this. The number of sea turtles stranded increased dramatically, and in this picture you can actually see a stranded turtle, and it's completely covered with oil. And so it's very clear that the oil spill actually increased the number of stranded turtles in this particular case. And this study illustrated very clearly the impact of oil, even like very small concentrations of oils on the development of a large fish. So in this case you can see they had control treatments without any oil, and they are really nice, and they developed without any trouble for bluefin tuna, yellow fin tuna, and amberjack. But compare these pictures with the oil exposed embryos. These are like completely deformed, right? And they noticed that the biggest issue was the heart development. So when your heart is weak, you may develop normally, but you really don't have enough energy to swim. So their swimming performance actually reduced, and when you can't swim, as I mentioned before, you cannot find food and you can't evade from predators, so you are very vulnerable and you won't survive for a long time. Okay, so with that, let's move to Ecuador. This map actually summarizes the distribution of oil and gas production facilities. This purple line is the major oil and gas pipelines, and the yellow areas are areas where they actually mine for gas and oil, and bright orange is already areas of oil exploration which is happening right now, and the hashed yellow areas are proposed areas. And you can clearly see that most of the Amazon is under immense threat, and these green boundaries indicate major wildlife reserves, and this one is Yasuni National Park, and we realize that this national park is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. So it's pretty clear that the entire Amazon is under immense threat of oil explorations, and they will be actually transforming some of the rainforests to build these facilities, and once they are actually transporting oil, there's a huge chance of spills. So we don't have any scientific studies summarizing the impacts of oil and gas spills in Ecuador, but I think we can actually extrapolate our knowledge from previous 2 case studies to this situation. So let's go through some slides. So this is a site where they actually dispose their waste products. So it's an open pit, and you can see it's full of crude oil, and you see that there's no any vegetation in the contaminated site, and you would expect some direct death of some organisms and some developmental anomalies, some issues with body condition and health, things like that, but there's no any studies in this area. So we may actually collect some really cool data for the first time on ecological impacts. This is another site. In this case, it's a small river, and you can see that the river is contaminated, but they are trying to reduce the spread of the crude oil, and there's a barrier, but you can still expect some hydrocarbons passing through this barrier. So as you remember, even small concentrations of hydrocarbons can create some significant issues with developing embryos of aquatic organisms. And in this case, it's a damaged oil pipe, and you can clearly see the contaminated site. So we can imagine lots of ecological impacts of such a site. And finally, this picture shows a contaminated frog. As you can remember, frogs are one of the most sensitive groups of organisms. They breathe through their skin, so they are directly exposed to all these contaminants. And people, so right now we don't have any solid studies on the ecological impacts of Ecuadorian Amazon oil spills impacts. So I guess we are going to go there and explore more about these ecological impacts in Amazon. Thank you.